gentlemen, brothers, fellow barbarians. The German barbarian returns once again from the not-so-sunny Isle of Ireland to, quite fittingly, talk about an Irish content creator and what he's recently been delving into, recently been discussing on various podcasts. Uberboyo has recently been talking about the electromagnetic field of living beings, essentially their aura, you could say. Now, very brief introduction for those of you that don't know who Uberboyo is, which I don't think is a lot of people. He's grown to be a pretty big, almost mainstream, you could say, content creator, but essentially he is a philosophical creator, some politics as well, relatively well known in the sort of Nietzsche adjacent new right type of online sphere. He's pretty big on Carl Jung, and a pretty fervent Nietzschean for many years, or at least he used to be. More recently, however, Stef seems to have turned away from Nietzsche, at least to an extent, and developed a greater liking for Plato, specifically his notion of forms, the ideal form. Now, to give a very brief and rough-hewn summary of this concept, Plato essentially postulated that there was a metaphysical realm, you could say, called the world of forms, world of ideas, a realm of divine perfection, essentially, from which the world of matter, the material world that we perceive, can touch, etc., is derived. And the best way to quickly explain this is to think of a geometrical shape, like a circle, a square, that sort of thing. If you build, carve, or even draw a circle in the material world, it is only ever an approximation of the mathematical concept. Zoom in close enough on any circle, and every circle is uneven or slightly oval in shape. And the same thing goes for a square. No matter how precisely you construct it with pencil and ruler, if you get close enough, it's slightly imperfect. Even if the length of the sides is only off by a millimeter, a nanometer even, if the corners' angles are skewed by a tiny fraction of a degree, it's technically not a true square, right? The circle, the square, the same-sided triangle, and so on are actually ideas, notions of an ideal form that theoretically, mathematically, exists, but can't be reproduced in the material world. However, since we can conceptualize them, understand what they are, and the laws of physics, the laws of nature, seem to be governed by not just these shapes, but mathematical concepts, etc. as well, they are real, in some sense. And Plato would say that's because they exist in the world of forms. So the world of forms is this divine realm, one might say, that defines the laws of our reality and forms the basis for the world of matter, which is derived from it. This idea is essentially the foundation for the metaphysics of, for example, and perhaps most notably, Christianity. Our fallen world, quote-unquote, being a sort of imperfect version of the immaculate kingdom of God, heaven. In heaven, no conflict, no suffering, etc. exists, because these are all results of the imperfections of the material realm. This, of course, clashes heavily with one of the core ideas of Nietzsche, who basically calls Christianity and all ideologies like it complete and utter cope, and states that this transgenerational, downright legendary mother of all coping sessions, arose from the inability of weak individuals to express their will in the world. Faced with shitty life circumstances and unable or perhaps unwilling to deal with them in a based Giga Chad sort of way, oppressed peoples espouse what he calls a slave morality, which classifies everything constituting their suffering as evil. This is because the material world is actually just a sort of prison, keeping them from the real, the true realm of their God, whatever it may be, where everything is, love and sunshine and everyone is nice and stuff. Similar notions exist in other belief systems as well, again, so this is not something that's necessarily unique to Christianity. And Christianity is kind of focused on the idea of love being the sort of core unifying concept. There are other ideologies, religions that have other unifying cores, concepts that they see as their ultimate truth. But the general idea, the general metaphysics, is more or less the same. So yeah, this is not something that's necessarily unique to Christianity, but Christianity is, of course, the major carrier / driving force of such beliefs in the West, and this is why Nietzsche focused on this particular religion when exploring these thoughts. Now, our friend Friedrich, with the legendary mustache, contrasts such conceptions of the world with what he calls master morality. Value systems that seek to strengthen the individual, make it more radiant, more beautiful, more powerful, grant it greater agency in the world, you could maybe say in a sort of general sense. In essence, strive towards bringing out the potential hidden within and continuously enhance the people as a whole as a result. A culture that espouses master morality promotes virtues like strength, beauty, vitality, charisma, sharpness of mind, and so on. In contrast, a culture steeped in slave morality seeks to eliminate suffering, reducing what it considers evil rather than channeling struggle into strengthening the self. And thus it considers kindness, selflessness, and even meekness virtues, while things like strength or intelligence are neither good nor bad, and in any case merely a tool to serve others. A strong, healthy, beautiful individual is in no way inherently better than a weak, sickly uggo, and may in fact be considered a worse, quote-unquote, person if he doesn't serve others, even if he doesn't proactively seek to harm them either. Getting back to the topic at hand, Nietzsche basically asserts that the world of matter, the quote-unquote mortal realm, is in fact the real deal, and that delusions about the superiority of an immaculate world of ideas or a kingdom of heaven without suffering are just the neurotic copium of weak individuals with an even weaker will to life, a stunted inner drive to grow and overcome in the attempt to enact their will upon the world. Meanwhile, real Agarthan Uberchads see suffering as the thing that actually makes life worth living in the first place. Only through suffering can growth occur. Only through suffering can pleasure even exist. Only the possibility of failure, of defeat, annihilation, allows for the true elation and sublimity of victory. Without light, there is no darkness, and without darkness, no light. There is no such thing as flawless perfection, no reality of actually achieving true excellence. Such ideals are unattainable. They are not a real thing. Yet in striving towards a higher ideal, man reaches ever greater heights, and in grasping for the unattainable, he achieves beauty. Alright, after this long-winded tangent, this 10-episode anime flashback, we are now more or less up to speed on the basis for what this video is actually about. So let us return to Uberboyo and the topic of the electromagnetic arc. In recent podcasts, Stef discussed his discovery of biological research into the electromagnetic fields of living things, and how they correspond with regenerative processes in particular, pioneered by Robert Otto Becker in the last century and expanded upon by contemporary researchers like Michael Levin. The ability of salamander species like the axolotl to fully regrow entire limbs, for example, is attributed to their electromagnetic field maintaining the proper form, if you will, of the salamander, thus serving as a sort of blueprint, one might say, which is then filled out by actual biological matter. By altering this field, limbs can be made to regrow improperly or not at all, without altering the DNA in any way, shape, or form. It is also possible to enable similar regenerative processes in species that don't normally have the ability to regrow limbs, like frogs, or even force the growth of additional limbs, all by manipulating the electromagnetic field. And Uberboyo relates this phenomenon to Plato's world of forms. It is essentially a proof of concept to an extent. Beyond the biochemical abilities of the cells themselves, there exists essentially an ideal form, as he calls it, of the organism. A concept that is stored in this electromagnetic field, sort of like a digital blueprint, again, and the existence of the concept of the non-material form allows the salamander to regrow a perfectly healthy and functional limb with all its complexities, because the idea of the limb, of the entire salamander, in fact, is present independently of the material reality of the animal's main body. And an even more extreme and thus illustrative example of this would be the planarian flatworm, which I believe Stef also might have mentioned at some point. This creature can regrow its entire body from just a small fragment. If you cut a flatworm into 5 pieces, let's say, each piece can regenerate into a full flatworm within a few weeks. And we are not talking about some amorphous blob of random cells here. The flatworm has a digestive system, a head with eyes and a brain, simple as they may be. It is a more or less complex multi-cell organism, an animal even. And it is, for all intents and purposes, immortal. All thanks to extensive aura maxing, if you want. So, is the Platonian notion of the world of forms correct? Is it true in a very literal sense, at least in a way? Are we actually not growing, improving, overcoming at all? Not really reaching new heights, but simply zoning in on the true ideal form of the human that already theoretically exists in the metaphysical. Now, Uberboyo notes that aesthetic high points of human history, namely classical Greece and the Renaissance, share a key characteristic in their depiction of the human form. Rather than exaggerating certain features representing desirable traits, such as huge disproportionate muscles on men, or ginormous bazungas and a fat ass on women, symbolizing physical power and fertility, respectively, the paintings and especially the statues of ancient Greek and Renaissance artists display a more balanced, perfected quote-unquote human form, almost lifelike in their shape and general aesthetic. They do look good, they are beautiful, muscular, vital, but not absurd, not exaggerated, not a caricature version of man, if you will. Rather, an idealized one that elegantly merges a sense of power, agility, and grace. Not a bloated IFBB mass monster or a pencil-limbed endurance runner, but a hybrid athlete. Now, Stef uses this fact to further strengthen the idea that there is actually a pre-existing ideal form of the human body, and that these artistic convergences are, in fact, the result of a general, broader convergence of various biological, material expressions of that human form towards the true metaphysical ideal, the perfect version. So, on the surface, what we've just talked about seems very compelling, and might cause some Nietzsche glazers to feel a bit shaken in their foundations. Again, this seems to be the case for Uberboyo himself, though it might just be a storytelling device he uses to explore the topics we've just touched on. That I, of course, can't say. And some of you might be questioning your own convictions, turning your backs on vitalism to rot your brains with Neoplatonic metaphysics instead, to cower like a good little boy at the feet of old Jesus. But there is a clear leap in logic here that I haven't really seen addressed. And it might be because Uberboyo is a very eloquent, compelling storyteller. In fact, I think many who have listened thus far, or heard him speak about this topic in one of the aforementioned podcasts, may have missed it completely. So let me repeat the argument in simple, short fashion. Living beings, plants, animals, the human animal, emanate an electromagnetic field that contains in some way the information for their proper quote-unquote form. If the material manifestation of said form is distorted, for example by losing a limb, the field still maintains this proper form, and thus actually allows for the full regeneration of complex biological structures based on the blueprint. This means that there is essentially a pre-existing ideal form, quote-unquote, of the species, which the material body simply tries to fill out, if you will, to the best of its abilities within the given environment. Now, did you spot the gap in our logic? It's a rather small part of what I just talked about, but has pretty significant consequences for the conclusions to be drawn here. Nothing we have talked about in any way proves or even clearly implies that the form stored by the electromagnetic field is a Platonian ideal or serves to strive towards such a thing. So the field essentially stores the plan for a healthy, fully functioning, well-formed, complete version of the individual of the given species. And even if the material body doesn't align with that version perfectly, the stored form doesn't change. And Stef seems to take this to mean that there is, in fact, a standardized, transcendental, prescriptive version of the given species, an ideal form, again, that the biological matter tries to achieve. But there is a much simpler answer here, which, based on what we've discussed, is just as plausible. That the form Uberboyo takes to be the perfect version of, say, a human, is actually just the collective information passed on by the members of the species who reproduced. The average of the memories, you could say, of everyone who came before. Much the same way DNA is. Now, it is not necessarily stored in the form of DNA. It is not necessarily passed on the same way, and where and how it is exactly stored, how this mechanism works, is unclear, at least for now. But it could function in much the same way, and the results would be more or less the same. If you think of a human who is living right now, think of yourself. Now you think of a human who lives in, say, the next town over, or even a different state from you. Say you live in the US, right? You're in, I don't know, you live in Pennsylvania. And you think of someone who lives in New York, or whatever, right? Now, you two are not related at all, so you don't share a genealogy for the last couple hundred years. Maybe your first shared ancestor shows up after we go a few hundred years back. Maybe it's more than that, right? Maybe it's close to a millennium, although that is unlikely. But think about how long humans have been around. How many generations of humans do you share in your ancestry? And how many generations of humans would have been fairly similar if you take all of them and draw the average form out of that? So if you take every single one of these individuals, right, and you put them in a computer simulation, and you try to create a 3D average of all of their forms, would those forms be particularly different? No, probably not. Because, yes, humans can be pretty tall, pretty short. Like, there's a decent bit of variation between humans. But across your entire ancestry, if we look at people who successfully reproduced, and we find the average of all of those, and then we look at someone else and do the same thing, would those two forms be drastically different? No. They would be pretty similar. Does that mean, however, that they are literally the same thing? That they are actually literally, in terms of the information that is stored, the same form? And more importantly, does that mean that they are a transcendental form? A pre-existing form, a primordial ideal form of the human body that exists in this metaphysical, again, world of forms. This is kind of a placeholder here, obviously, for the more general concept, but no, none of this can be derived from what we talked about. It could just as well be a sort of zoning in on a form, sure, but for the purposes of effectiveness. Again, the result simply of those who were successful passing on their memory of effective forms. So it could very well be something that is entirely emergent. And again, if we go back to what I mentioned about aesthetic golden ages, the thing Uberboyo talked about when it comes to this sort of convergence of the display, the portrayal of the human form in art. Is there a shared way of going about portraying the human form between, again, let's say, ancient Greece and the Renaissance? Yeah, sure, of course. I think that is because their general approach to a high-quality man, let's say, to an idealized man, is the same. So they are going less for hyper-specialization and more for this sort of generalized ideal. But that doesn't mean that the actual portrayal is the same and is based on the same ideal form. In fact, I would argue that it isn't. Now, you might say, well, yeah, there's some differences in physical appearance. Obviously, the stonemasons, let's say, in the Renaissance had different tools available, different technology available, that sort of thing. So there might be some differences, but the general sort of thing is similar enough. It's pretty close. And that is true to an extent, But I think if you actually look closely at the way humans are portrayed here in these two different ages, you do see some differences. Both portrayals go for a sort of realism, a realistic portrayal of a very high quality body, again, powerful, agile, vital, beautiful, etc. The artistic approach is maybe the same, because we have a recurrence of a similar sort of artistic theme, as opposed to, again, very expressive, very exaggerated sort of things. But the actual bodies are different. If you look at statues from the Renaissance, for example, I would say on average, the bodies are a little bit more impressive. And I think that's because this collective memory of what I would consider to be the average form, what Uberboyo thinks is the ideal form of the human body, has evolved. Not to a significant extent. Again, if you look at these statues sort of very briefly, very surface level, you might say, well, this is more or less the same, right? The old meme, this is the same picture. But if you look closely, and especially if you're someone who comes from a sports background, a lifting background, that sort of thing, you can see differences. The Renaissance statues are just a little bit more, they have a slightly more impressive jacked to ripped ratio. They're just a little bit more muscular, a little bit more shredded compared to that muscularity, perhaps. The muscles are a little bit more pronounced. You see specific muscles. I'll try to throw up some examples here if I remember. Specific muscles being a little bit more prominent. So it seems like the general approach to the artistic portrayal here is perhaps similar, more or less the same, but the actual form that is being portrayed has evolved. And I wouldn't necessarily say that it has zoned in on an even more average ideal. Rather, I would say that across the board, they are generally a little bit more impressive. And again, I think this is because the forms that can be achieved, and that perhaps were achieved, in the time in between, became a little bit more impressive. There's a little bit more material for the collective memory, and so the form can be a little bit more crazy. And in this same vein, I would say that based on our modern understanding of anatomy, etc., the ideal form, quote unquote, which again I don't think is an ideal form actually, can be physically more impressive than displayed by these past golden ages. So, in my opinion, we have a slight evolution of the physiques being displayed, and I'm not just talking aesthetically here, I'm talking overall level of impressiveness. A little bit more muscular without being more chunky necessarily, more pronounced specific muscle groups, etc. Not a huge difference. Not a difference that maybe some random person that goes for a jog twice a week would notice, but there is a difference. And in that same vein, if we go from the Renaissance to now, I think, again, we can conceive, at least I can definitely conceive, of a more impressive physical form than was the case in the Renaissance. Right? When I look at Renaissance statues, I can conceptualize a more impressive form. And again, this is based on our elevated standards, which in turn are caused by our elevated capabilities to achieve more impressive physical form. But not because we've gotten closer to zoning in on the ideal, because we've reached a new level and can achieve new heights within that level. But once we get close to or achieve these heights, we haven't reached an ideal. We haven't finished the campaign. We haven't completed the game. We've just reached the next level. So again, this ideal form described by Uberboyo is not at all necessarily prescriptive, primordial, transcendental. It could just as well be, in a very Jungian sense, the accumulation of the collective memory, quote unquote, of a species, family, genus, whatever, right? And this allows the salamander to regrow his arm, his leg, because his body, or his body's electromagnetic field, holds the memory of countless salamanders, or their general type of species, animal, etc., which it utilizes towards recreating the arm. So the arm is not recreated based on a primordial blueprint, it is recreated based on a blueprint that is the accumulation of the memory of a gazillion salamanders that this guy is descended from, who had both arms, or both legs. And in that same vein, the human ideal form could simply be the accumulation of collective memory of effective past designs in terms of overall physical prowess, health, ability to attract partners, etc. So total all-around functionality. And the reason why this is a fairly balanced form, and that balanced form hasn't varied too much, again, we see maybe some differences between ancient Greece and the Renaissance portrayals, but not very significant. The sort of overall idea is very similar. The reason why that is because the use case of these bodies and the ability to forge them into something significantly greater was comparatively limited by food, by survival needs, etc., right? There would not have been a huge difference between classical Athens and 15th, 16th century Italy in terms of the ability to build muscle, etc., right? We're talking specifically about muscle here, but this goes for everything else that is part of this as well. Obviously, there are some differences, and again, I do think we see some differences in the portrayal, but there wouldn't have been as significant a difference as between, again, let's say the Renaissance and now. We have significantly greater abilities to create these freaky bodies, and perhaps more importantly, the things we use them for, the threats we have to deal with. If we look at ancient Greece versus the Renaissance, again, also wouldn't have been all that different. In the Renaissance, they had some gunpowder, but generally speaking, even warfare was generally still very similar in terms of what the individual would be doing, carrying equipment, swinging weapons, all that sort of stuff. So, if we look at the sort of breadth of what a person and the collective average of all of their ancestors would have been doing and would have needed a body for, it would be more or less the same. But that doesn't mean that it can't be something significantly greater or significantly different. It just means that due to the circumstances this blueprint was generated in, there's not much of a difference. And it's a very balanced, sort of generalized blueprint. So, to tie this whole thing together and kind of bring it to a close, what it really comes down to is a question of belief. The question whether you want to believe that the purest, sort of most fundamental instinct of life is, in a sense, downgoing towards a sort of ideal form or something like it. We could say more generally a form of perfection, of true perfection, right? This form of perfection exists. It is a metaphysical reality, whether it exists in the world of forms or in the kingdom of heaven or whatever the fuck, doesn't really matter, right? But that there is a sort of endpoint there is a ultimate perfection, and this may or may not be achievable, but it exists. It's a real thing, and it is prescriptive. It is transcendental. It is primordial, and the instinct drives life towards this form, a will to form, you could say, right? Or, if you want to believe that any such notion of perfection, of a true ideal, is just the imagination of the given population at the given time, and is only a tool, a temporary goal to strive towards to reach new heights, the next level. That there is no ultimate endpoint to be achieved, no ultimate perfect ideal form that we are striving towards, but that there is only more power, more greatness, more strength, more ability to enact your will upon the world, and that this can be achieved by setting goals, sort of temporary ideals. Oh, this is the ultimate form, I think, and then working towards that until either the individual, or if we're talking more collectively here, the species, is relatively close to achieving it, only to then realize that by that point you have collected so much information, you have evolved so drastically, that you can create an entirely new ideal that blows the last one out of the park. And to be honest, without trying to throw too much shade here at Uberboyo, at Stef, because I do like his content a lot, I think he's an awesome creator, I think the first outlook on reality, on metaphysics, on life, is the less creative one. It is looking from the current perspective at what is sort of at the edges of the conceivable and saying, I can conceive right now of something that I would roughly approximate to be an ideal. So ideals are real. Perfection is real. There is an end point to be reached. Rather than saying, I can imagine something that is greater than where I'm at right now, and I have the confidence that once I reach it or get close to it, I will have grown, surpassed myself, again, as an individual, as a people, as a species, whatever, to the point where I can imagine something new. I think this is the much more positive, life-affirming perspective, but in any case, both possibilities are equally possible. Okay? Because any argument you can make for an ideal, for perfection, for ultimate truth, can be immediately swept away. If you say, well, there are laws of physics, right? And maybe we don't have them down perfectly, but we can clearly tell the more we look into the mechanics of how things interact with each other on a kinetic level, let's say. The more we look into that, the more we can tell, okay, this is just an interaction of forces, and there are clear rules here that cannot be broken. Well, maybe. But think about the fact that we can only test these rules in our perceivable three-dimensional space. We don't know how the fuck the laws of physics work if we were, say, able to perceive 6 dimensions. I think a lot of things would probably change. And maybe the question is not whether the laws of physics as we understand them right now are ultimate, which I think anyone who has looked into theoretical physics in recent times knows is probably already a little bit questionable. If we go into quantum physics, that sort of thing, our, let's say, traditional understanding of physics becomes a little bit wishy-washy, a little bit problematic. But yeah, what is to say that there isn't something conceivable that breaks the laws of physics as we understand them now, and we just aren't at the level yet to understand it, to conceive of it, to think on this sort of plane. We're getting a little bit crazy here, schizomaxing a little bit, so I think I'm going to leave it at that. The video is long enough. And yeah, we'll see if I cut this up, make it a little bit of an essay style video, or if I leave it a little bit more raw. I was thinking about making this a live stream, but I don't have my PC here, and I was a little bit too lazy, to be honest, to set up the whole live stream spiel on my laptop, so you guys will have to make do with a video. That's going to be that. I hope you guys enjoyed yourselves, found this philosophical rambling entertaining, and learned something potentially. If you did, go ahead and leave a like. And if you want to support my channel, me making videos on training, health, philosophy, a sort of generalist, holistic approach to fitness, go ahead and leave a like as well, and go ahead and subscribe down below. Also, let me know if you like these types of videos. It's been a long while since I've made a more sort of essay style philosophical video. So if you enjoy these videos, let me know down below in the comments. And if you want to push the algorithm a little bit, just drop a random comment, reply to yourself, or whatever the fuck. I don't know what the YouTube meta is at this point. Go ahead and check out the Primal Physique course over on Ko-fi. If you want to support the channel in general, you can head over to Ko-fi, drop a donation, or even better, grab one of the training programs for $2-3, so you actually get something for your money, rather than just giving me random cash. If you're interested in a more comprehensive course on training, on diet and nutrition, on habits outside of training that will improve your fitness, on the general mentality, all these sorts of things that will allow you to achieve what I call the primal physique, which is a sort of hybrid physique that is strong, that is capable, that is not just big and muscly, but is also fast, enduring, all these types of things, and looks good. If that's something you're interested in, go ahead, check out the Primal Physique course. It's not super long. I tried to cut it down to make it real nice and concise, so you don't have me rambling for hours. So yeah, go ahead, check out the Primal Physique course, go grab it. There's some training programs in there as well. And yeah, you'll have everything you need to build a nice, juicy body, clean physique. If you want a more personalized approach, if you want to talk to someone in person, you want me to make a personalized training program for you, we can do that as well. Just go ahead and hit me up either on Ko-fi or on Instagram, which is down below in the description as well. And yeah, shoot me a message. We can talk about what does your week look like, your day-to-day, you know, what would be a good dietary fit for you. What are your athletic goals? Do you do a sport? Do you want to build muscle primarily? All these types of things. So if you're interested in personal coaching, go ahead and shoot me a message over there. That's going to be it. I hope you guys had a good time. I definitely enjoy recording this video, even though my throat is slowly giving out now. Pause. Yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one. And until then, have a good one.